University. You might go out or stay here, or you go whenever we completed this speech, as you like. So please stay, and then we will have 1 more hour with 2 fantastic presentations. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Isvan. Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. I'm not sure it's going to be special, my intervention. I will do my best to inject some fireworks, but the special nature of the intervention has to do with the fact that it was not included into the previous panels, so it's coming at the end. And it might try to contextualize some of the conversations you had during the day through a European lens. So perhaps we can replace the special nature of my talk with the word Europe, European perspective on what is happening. So what is the context within which this conversation on online disinformation is currently happening through the continent. And in particular, the angle I will take is the regulatory angle. So a lot is happening. There has been a sudden awakening, I would say, of the political class across Europe that something has to be done. And this sense of urgency is not necessarily the best approach you can take when you want to regulate a problem. According to public policy, you regulate a problem when the problem has been well defined. And here, very often, we get confused on what we're talking about. In particular, when you look at the European perspective, the entry point for the European Union to do something about so-called online disinformation has been countering propaganda. So it has been a very specific and narrow approach to the way in which information is created, is propagated, and is spreading across Europe. And this is exactly the logic that somehow led the European External Action Service to develop a particular service that was born as a counter-propaganda system, and that became and somehow was upgraded to a fact-checking system. And one of my major criticisms as a scholar, as somebody who has been studying and trying to interact with the European institutions since this debate, is the lack of clarity on where the counter-propaganda ends and when the fact-checking begins, or perhaps vice versa. In this conceptual ambiguity is further, I would say, supported by one of the major, I think, methodological issues we face today. So the difficulty to gather evidence about the reach of the so-called online disinformation phenomenon across European countries. We don't have much data. And therefore, if we have a doubt about the nature of the problem, and we have concerns about the real reach that this disinformation is having, are we really well placed as a society to regulate something we don't know? And you know, I'm teaching law, I'm teaching public policy, and if I don't define a problem, I struggle in understanding how we can get it right. So I need to play the devil's advocate, and I need to ask questions, and trying to dig where the evidence is or lies today. So let me start from this major claim. We don't have much evidence about the online disinformation that today we consider to be the major responsible for much of the political events which are happening these days. Is intuitively an excellent explanation, but unfortunately we don't have the empirical evidence. We see trends, we see patterns, we see evidence here and there floating, but we don't have a full picture. So please don't consider my methodologically reframing of the issue as an attempt at trivializing or at countering the need to do something about it, because I'm definitely a supporter. But I think that we need to be alert and to be aware that if we step in to regulating this area, complex area, there will be costs and benefits, but we also have a moral duty to know what we're talking about. So the only evidence I could find in the first attempt at carrying out evidence-based analysis on the reach of online disinformation is limited, and yet it's been carried out by a few papers, in particular by a paper by the Oxford Institute, Internet Oxford Institute, that shows some interesting elements that I would like to share with you at the very beginning of this conversation, in order also to trigger the debate. And the realities of online disinformation stemming from such a report, which has been focusing on two major countries, Italy and France, tell us the following. We need to identify the publishers of demonstrably fake news, example in France, Russia TV and Sputnik, and the measurement of the site's reach, the attention they generate, and the number of interactions. So when we look at this so-called on-site reach or direct reach, how many people are actually reading those websites that we had previously identified? So already methodologically, I already set aside a big issue, right? But let's say we have identified those sites. How many people are actually doing this? So the numbers in both Italy and France are around 1% of the online population on a monthly basis. That compares with 20-25% with Le Monde, with La Repubblica, Corriere della Sera, and mainstream news paper or media outlet. However, there's also something that has to be said, that 1% of this 1% that watches these sites might also watch only those sites. So they might completely miss all the other real, between brackets, information. But actually it's not happening. There's a lot of overlap. Those people are visiting the 1%, so the 1% people are also part of the 25% looking at Corriere della Sera or other mainstream journal. The view of this 1%, when you look at the duration, at the spent length of time, is very, very short, is very, very speedy. But of course, the scenario becomes more complex when you're looking at the amplification, of course, produced by those media news through social media. And here, methodologically, Facebook has been pre-selected as the most promising and the one that can give us a better sense of what is happening. And here we see a handful of these media outlets which are spreading false news, a handful of them, which are able to generate as much as the mainstream Le Monde, Corriere della Sera's news when they are copy-pasted on the inbox, on the wall of Facebook, and sometimes they do even better. So it's pretty clear that that's where the issue lies. But most of these websites which are spreading demonstrably fake news are not necessarily reaching the same amount. We're talking about a handful of them. So it's pretty clear that we need more evidence to go further. The other side of the story is the methodological difficulty to capture further amplifications of how these news are spreading. Think about bilateral interactions. I've read this and I'm going to send it through a WhatsApp to a friend or to a mailing list through emails. We're not going to be able to capture this. It's much more complicated to do this. And as you know, one of the major regulatory issues in Brussels these days is and has to do with the so-called e-privacy directive, the so-called cookies directive, that would potentially also apply to WhatsApp, potentially apply to websites that today, or to applications that today escape these forms of control by making them subject to regulatory requirements. And there's a further element that I think in Hungary has to be stressed as much as it should be in my country of origin, which is Italy. That today the major political generator of many fake news is politicians themselves, whose message is then reproduced by newspapers who are actually doing their job in somehow conveying what political leaders have been expressing to the public. So you see the difficulty of capturing the outreach of many of the so-called fake news, assuming we're going to find a methodology to define this, because the scenario, the overall scenario, political and geopolitical, is going very, very fast. So I'm coming now to the second part of the presentation, after having shared with you some of my perplexities and difficulties in defining the problem, which is going to be devoted to the regulatory approach. So what we can do about it. What do we see emerging in Europe? If you're optimistic, you can say that Europe is facing what US constitutional legal scholars define experimental federalism. This idea that you might have different models, the Hungarian model, the German model, the French model of tackling online disinformation. But if you're pessimistic, you can also say, well, each of them is trying to do something about it without any real commitment to get it right, to have a real impact. And most of this regulatory intervention, if you're pessimistic, might seem a bit cosmetic. We need to show the electorate that we are concerned about it. And I see a lot of this behind the scenes when you look at how these French, German, Italian regulatory approaches lacking fake news are emerged. So 3 major solutions that I think in my little taxonomy can be identified. The first one is the called Ministries of Truth approach that was mentioned already today, state intervention, expecting the state to qualify in one way or another a particular news outlet and a particular news coming out of an outlet as somehow problematic because it matches a set of criteria. Here you can look at the US approach of the Global Engagement Center. You can look at the disinformation review itself. Attempts at doing a top-down approach based on a possible methodology. The second approach has to do with shifting the responsibility from the public authorities to the market. And this is the third-party liability approach that I think was mentioned today. So the possibility of making, for the first time in history, platforms, social platforms and websites responsible for the contents other people are uploading on it. Which, you know, when I talk to my kids, they look at me like, but shouldn't this be already the case? Why do we allow online platforms not to be responsible for the contents they actually carry? This should be the default, right? But the default is that they are not responsible. And Germany decided to counter this approach by saying, no, we're going to be the first country ever through the German Network Enforcement Act that is going to shift the liability on this social platform. This is the second approach. Very interesting, very experimental. It has been into force only for a few months. But it's also an approach that has been criticized. Because at the end of the day, the social platform, they are going to further outsource this activity in order not to incur in sanctions to third-party entities, which in principle can be fact-checkers, but can also be other entities who will have their say on the veracity of the information which are reproduced. And should they disagree, meaning should they be fined by the state and then challenge this before courts, it will be the courts, the judges, who will have the final word, which of course raises a huge epistemic choice. Are we really sure that judges are well placed to make such an assessment? So this is the German example, and perhaps some other countries are moving into this direction. We also may include in this second categorization the French example, which is very specific, is very narrow, is a French bill, as you might have heard, is a proposal, very much crafted by the government, going through the parliament now. I discussed it last week at the Assemblée Nationale. And the idea of this bill, the French approach, differs from the German one. The German one is very broad in scope. It's about relying on torts, on liability. Whereas the French one is more about tackling the issue of online disinformation in relation to political electoral moment in French society. It is a system that would enable everyone to become a watchdog of what is happening on the media sphere by reporting to the authorities and to the judges themselves, asking the judges to suspend in the 60 days before an elections contents that might raise doubts. So once again we rely on the judges, but in a different way. Not to establish liability, but to simply prevent exposure from certain news during an electoral campaign. And this approach is combined with a transparency approach, disclosure requirements that would be imposed on the sponsoring part of political contents. And finally, we have a third approach, which has been mentioned today, and which is probably the most successful in terms of number of actors supporting it, including the European Union itself, which is the self-regulatory approach. Self-regulatory, in theory of regulation, does not really have a good track record. When we let industries regulate themselves, usually they don't manage to. There are a few exceptions, like the alcohol marketing in the US. But in general, self-regulation doesn't really seem promising as an approach. But here, given the circumstances, that's what we're doing. We are basically showing a stick and giving a carrot to the industry and saying, hey, here we got it right, you got it wrong. It is about to become part of the solution and not only being the problem. So as you might know, these days, these weeks, the European Commission has convened a stakeholder platform which is made in this particular moment by the industry itself, which are regulating and they are establishing principles that will somehow complement the first communication of the Commission that came a few months ago, that basically said that's the best we can do. We need to rely on the goodwill of the industry to self-regulate by self-constraining the way in which they do sponsor contents, they do convey about the actors and about the scale of their activities, so forth and so on. It is an approach that I've been criticizing over time. This is the approach that prevented me from becoming one of the experts in this committee. It would have prevented me from being critical and to be independent. I would have been captured into this process, to the point that there has been only one minority opinion so far in the overall work. Nature of the exercise, again, it was a bit false in the sense that on the one hand it should have been a multi-stakeholder platform, on the other hand it revealed to be I would say a self-regulatory platform already in the pre-stage that led to the decision to rely on. So either we are representing interest or we are collecting expertise. And here we've been doing both, and that's what we're doing in Europe at the moment. There's a fourth approach, and I'm going to close, that is an approach that might feed into every single regulatory approach, as I mentioned earlier, which has to do with the behavioral intervention, the possibility of matching the media literacy demand that we have today with the design of the presentation of the information so as to neutralize the partisan nature of the way in which certain information are presented. So an example is provided today by one of the features of Facebook, that when you copy-paste the news, will automatically generate alternative sources that have covered that particular news, so that you, as a reader, you will be exposed to many different points of view. And I express my favor for one of these approaches, despite the actual self-regulatory nature of this. Facebook is doing it, Twitter is testing it, but of course it might also become mandatory. So we could also imagine any regulatory regime mandating outlets to systematically reshuffle the architecture of choice that readers face when deciding what to read. And this might offset, might neutralize the way in which many people get into their bubble and will force them to get out of the bubble. Once more, we lack empirical evidence. We don't know how much it works. There's already a sign of what we call wear-off effect, exactly like you have vis-a-vis the tobacco products warning, health warnings. The more you see it, the less it works. So there's already a wearing effect of the possibility of being exposed to many multiple news because you just see them lying at the bottom, like you don't scroll, or actually you don't switch to page number 2 of a Google search. So behaviorally informed presentation of news is probably a bit underexploited. These are forms of intervention used commercially for commercial purposes in order to make you click, but not to make you more informed. But what if we revert the incentive, if we change the incentives and we change the paradigm? Well, there is a possibility to feed some of these ideas into the regulatory framework to come. So I'm coming to a close. I've been deliberately provocative in the first part of my presentation, a bit more informative in the second part, but I will be happy to engage with you and to go deeper on some of those issues, and of course to listen to your criticism or to your perplexities. Thank you very much.
Firstly, thank you for this very interesting presentation, and I'm quite curious how you differentiate between self-regulation and platforms' responsibility, because I view that as one solution, because in fact self-regulation makes the platforms liable for the content which they don't regulate, if they don't censor the content. And just to add that the proposed Article 20B also opens the door for national regulation of platform providers for illegal content.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your question on the concept of self-regulation. There are different nuances. into self-regulation, but one of the major features of self-regulation is the absence of monitoring by public authorities. So pure self-regulation is about us agreeing of not doing something with a self-reporting duty to say to what extent by the end of the year we've been committing by our obligations. That's self-regulation. Then you have co-regulation. Co-regulation might entail a form of monitoring that might be given to a third party, that by the end of the year might be one of us saying, hey, you have done this, you have been doing this, this, and this. This is called regulation. But as soon as you have a sanction for that behavior, we are no longer in co or in self-regulation, we are into pure command and control. And this is the German regulation. German regulation is command and control. If you are turning a blind eye to hateful speech, upload it on your website, and you're not acting within X hours, you're going to be getting in trouble because you're going to be responsible civilly from a civil standpoint, and you have to pay a fine. So that's where we are. And again, this German regulatory approach is very unique. We don't have any other examples of third-party liability, and we know that both the US and the European approach, continental and non-continental Europe, have always carved out this exception for online platform not to be responsible for contents uploaded there. So this is a major breakthrough, but we don't know empirically whether it works or whether the benefits outweigh the cost of doing this. And I highlighted the cost, not the benefits, because I don't see them yet. Besides the fact that these social platforms have been hiring thousands and thousands of employees who actually do this work. And as you might have read on the newspapers, they're doing a very difficult job. Psychologically, they need to be assisted because they are exposed to contents that are extremely problematic. And they lack guidance, methodological guidance on what, and there's a lot of subjectivity in all of this. And of course, again, here, the epistemic question of who is better placed to do so, who has the knowledge, who has the element, who has the sense of the zeitgeist, what the zeitgeist that might justify a suppression of your post today because you have raised something that might seem a bit cutting edge, but perhaps it's part of your freedom of expression. To whom this question should belong to? This is the constitutional question.
Martin Mitrowski, Illiberal. So first of all, I think you forgot to mention also the Italian example where there is a police portal which lets citizens submit fake news. So I think we both agree that giving that sort of power to the state is very risky. But my question is actually about the legislative approaches that you mentioned. You said there were 3, 4. But what about maybe not forcing, but let's say trying to make platforms transparent, so giving access to data to academics, to organizations as ours, but also many others, which can actually expose the mechanisms, which can expose the networks, show how this information is being spread, who's behind it. What about that approach? It works on Twitter very well, as I showed in my presentation, and it's done just as well on Facebook and on other platforms. And then you could help it with it.
Yeah, thanks a lot for pushing me further. I wanted to provide you this taxonomy of regulatory approaches which are on the table, and I do not necessarily share them, but that's what's on the table in Europe at the moment, and many other countries are looking at us outside of Europe. But certainly the issue, and I've been writing this on newspaper, I've been writing this on my scientific literature, I think the problem lies well above this. I think the issue of online disinformation is much deeper than the issue of providing, collecting, reviewing information. The issue is the issue of business model that we have been tackling in the previous sessions. And here, the regulatory approaches should and could be significantly bolder, in particular in Europe, where Europe never really hesitated to change or disrupt the business model of a particular industry if this was not aligned to the interests of society. And here, we can see disclosure requirements as something that might be an imposition, but we can go even further above and imagine also command and control, meaning why should we allow and accept political advertising? Why should we allow political messaging to occur on those platforms? As you might know, political advertising generates around 5% of the overall revenue model of Facebook. So it's not very significant. You might expect Zuckerberg to already give up and say, well, I don't really need it. This is the source of many concerns. Strategically, you're going to give up this, and you move on. But of course, they don't want to do it because they're going to set a precedent. The fact that there might be limits to their ability to monetize the network effect that they have created over time. And there is a regulatory solution, which is antitrust and competition law. And this, of course, is a bit the elephant in the room when we look at online disinformation. How many of the issues we're discussing today could be solved upstream if we were taking bold decisions through investigations that might lead the industry themselves to organize differently and to lose the incentives stemming from one extra click? Because, of course, there's a misalignment there. A misalignment between the cost and the externality for society of the extra click, because they're generating and amplifying this negative news, which is fake, with the benefit of the company that is deriving money out of it. So there's an entire misalignment of what is good for society and what is good for a company. So the conditions are met for triggering some forms of competition intervention, because at the end of the day, competition law is about increasing consumer welfare. And that welfare is not generated by those platforms. But of course, this is a bit of a taboo question, even in Brussels, despite the boldness of Margaret Vestager and the competition team to tackle this. But this is something you can read in the lines of the very same report, of the high-level report on online disinformation. Competition law is there. It's not an instrument we gave up to using. We're not using it now, but we might at some point. And the hope, wishful thinking, is that the self-regulatory exercise might lead companies to realign partly and to match this misalignment existing between companies' interests and societal expectations.
And the very last question from Ida for comment.
Yes, so it's both a comment, mainly a comment, I must say. So I think you're mixing two different things, because you're talking about regulatory measures and disinformation in general, but then you kind of hinted that you're also talking about the disinformation review and maybe East Platform Task Force. You said the disinformation review at least before, or did I misunderstand you? Yeah. So just to get the facts straight, I had a presentation earlier about the work of East Platform. We're not a regulatory body at all. We're a communications campaign within the Strategic Communication Division of the EAS, raising awareness about the ongoing Russian disinformation campaign targeting the EU. So we're talking about regulatory measures concerning general disinformation in the post-truth era somehow, but then you're also mentioning particular initiatives that try to raise awareness about the Russian disinformation campaign, and I think we have evidence there. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2015, took a part of the country largely on the basis of using disinformation and misinformation, let's say. We have the Mueller investigation in the meddling of Russia in US elections in 2016. We also have our initiative and other initiatives that on a daily basis show the evidence of Russian disinformation targeting Europe. So just want to clarify, what are we talking about? So don't mix up different initiatives with each other. Thanks.
Well, I was expecting this question because I've been very critical vis-a-vis the activity that the European External Action Service has been undertaking, not because it's not well-intentioned, because it is well-intentioned, but as I said at the beginning, it is a counter-propaganda activity, and is not a fact-checking activity.
No, it's not.
Well, your director said to me that it's a counter-propaganda because that's the way in which you frame it. And what's the problem for me? And that's why I enlisted this in the first form of the intervention. Think about you just blogging about something, and that content being enlisted into this exercise. Well, there are reputational consequences stemming from the fact that your content has been enlisted there. It's inevitable. There are consequences stemming from there. So what I ask to your office and to the European External Action Service is, please let me know what's the methodology. What are the techniques you use? Which international standard of fact-checking are you using? Is it transparent? Is it published? And the answer has been, we don't really have a methodology.
Well, it's online.
It's online. You have online what? You have online the list of sources which are there. And the other answer was we have a set of fact checkers in Europe who use their own methodology, and they tell us and they help us into this activity. And they said, well, this is not in compliance with legal certainty in Europe. So if you do it, and you have to do it, and I'm a fan of what you're doing, trying to do it in compliance with law, otherwise you will expose yourself to criticism. And the second question was, to what extent do you allow the author of that source of information to be notified before being enlisted? Because there are reputational consequences stemming from it, and perhaps you get it wrong once. And the answer was, we don't notify in a systematic basis. And this is, again, a departure from the principle of legal certainty, and of course, the principle of due process. And the final question was, to what extent, if my content are going to be enlisted there into a newsletter, do I have the possibility to contest it and to say, well, I'm not sure that what I'm saying and arguing is really so departing from what I believe being true. And there's no possibility to challenge that. Again, yet another violation of due process under European law. So the invitation was constructed, the intention was constructed to say, keep doing what you're doing, but trying to realign a counter-propaganda exercise to a fact-checking exercise, because that's how you present it. And today when you do fact-checking, there are international standards to comply with. This was an invitation that I will continue putting forward, because I think there's a complexity in the understanding. But overall, what counts are the effects. If you start saying that an information qualifies as a fake news, you are triggering many reputational and economic consequences that have to be internalized. If you don't prepare for this, you expose yourself to criticism and you lack credibility vis-a-vis the international fact-checking community and vis-a-vis the very same enemies you want to fight against.
Do we have to close? I don't know whether you want to react to that, or very short, please.
Yes. Well, we are a communications campaign, so we are an awareness-raising initiative, let's say. We don't say we are fact-checkers, although we do cooperate with a lot of fact-checkers, and in fact we have since the beginning had a network of civil society actors that we cooperate with. So absolutely, definitely we do some of fact-checking ourselves due to us not having any budget so far, but hopefully with budget coming we won't be doing any of the fact-checking ourselves, but just collecting the pro-Kremlin messages that are spread from the Kremlin. So that is the purpose. If something is included there that doesn't want to, that will want to contest that they are included, Sputnik, RT, or any other of the Russian channels that we include on a regular basis, they can contact us through an online mechanism, although the Russian channels usually don't do that so far. But if they do, we would take it under consideration.
I hope we can close now, because it's a very important debate, maybe about methods and a legal position and maybe a more general position, but I'm not a judge to say anything. Thank you, Alberto, for your contribution. And again, without any break, please, Michael, the floor is yours. Thank you, Alberto.
Thank you, Isvan.